They say you can't take it with you. My children decided they couldn't wait. They planned to take my $50 million empire while I was still breathing. They should have remembered who built it. The steak was perfect, the wine was expensive, and the smiles on my sons' faces were poison. We were seated in a plush, semicircular booth at a high-end steakhouse in downtown Austin, the kind of place with dark wood paneling and waiters who moved with the silent, predatory grace of panthers. Charles, my eldest, swirled his 2018 Cabernet in his glass, a little affectation he'd picked up from a magazine article about looking like a CEO. He thought it made him look powerful. It only made him look rehearsed. Across the polished table, Leo, my younger boy, fidgeted with his silverware, his wife Penelope patting his hand with a look of such practiced sympathy it was almost theatrical. They thought their subtlety was a shield. They thought my age had made me oblivious. They were profoundly wrong on both counts. In my 76 years, I have learned that the most important conversations happen in the silences between words, and the air tonight was thick with the suffocating weight of unspoken intentions. "Mom," Charles began, his voice as smooth and cloying as honeyed whiskey, "we've been worried about you, truly, out on that big ranch all by yourself." Leo, ever the echo, chimed in, his tone pitched to sound earnest and concerned. "It's just too much for one person. The upkeep, the empty rooms, the isolation. We just want you to be comfortable. We want you to be safe." Penelope leaned forward, her diamond earrings catching the low light like trapped stars. Her smile was a perfect, sharp crescent. "We found the most wonderful place, Nicoletta. A community. It's called Sunset Vistas, out in Arizona. It's more like a 5-star resort than, you know. It has golf courses, swimming pools, spas, gourmet dining, everything you deserve after working so hard your whole life." She slid a glossy, heavyweight brochure across the table. The paper felt slick and cold beneath my fingers. On the cover, a group of silver-haired couples with impossibly white teeth laughed as they clinked wine glasses against a backdrop of a perfect airbrushed sunset. It looked like a prison designed by a marketing committee. They began to speak of my cognitive decline in hushed, careful tones, wrapping the deepest of insults in the soft language of love. They used words like forgetful and a little confused, referencing small, meticulously manufactured incidents from the past few weeks. A misplaced set of keys, which I knew Penelope had moved from the hook by the door to a drawer in the library. A missed doctor's appointment, for which Leo had deliberately given me the wrong time. It was a slow, deliberate campaign of gaslighting, designed to paint me as incompetent, a woman who could no longer be trusted with her own affairs. I let them talk. I nodded, arranging my face into a mask of weary consideration. I picked at my seared scallops, the rich food tasting like ash in my mouth. All the while, I watched their eyes. I saw the impatient flicker of greed behind Charles's performance of filial duty, the desperate avarice in Leo's gaze. They weren't worried about my safety. They were worried about the $50 million empire I had built from dust and grit, Vance Enterprises. They were worried it might slip through their fingers. That night, as they gently and lovingly explained the details of my own execution, I didn't argue. I just listened, memorizing every lie. A week later, my sons informed me they had hired a lawyer to help with the transition. Their words. They explained that they needed someone to handle the complex legal side of things, specifically the mountain of paperwork that would grant them durable power of attorney over my assets and health care. They wanted someone young, hungry, and, in Charles's chilling phrase, unburdened by old-fashioned sentimentality. They found Juliana Hayes. On paper, she was perfect for them, a rising star in corporate law, a brilliant mind from a public university who had clawed her way into a prestigious Austin firm. They saw an ambition they could purchase, a transactional soul just like their own. They met her in her sterile, glass-walled office and offered her a generous retainer and a success fee that amounted to a small fortune. They were confident she would see the cold, hard logic in helping two loving sons secure their inheritance from a mother who was losing her grip. What they didn't see, what their limited imaginations could never have conceived, was Juliana's real story. 15 years ago, Juliana was a brilliant, penniless student about to drop out of law school. Her scholarship had been unexpectedly cut. Her part-time job wasn't enough, and her family had nothing to give. She was days from packing her bags when a letter arrived. It was from an anonymous educational foundation, informing her that her tuition and living expenses would be covered in full until she passed the bar. There were no strings attached, no expectations of repayment. The only request was that someday, if she was ever in a position to do so, she would use her skills to help someone who couldn't help themselves. That foundation was one of my silent projects, a way of investing in people, not just property. I had started it in my late husband's name. Juliana never knew who her benefactor was, but she never forgot the debt. When my name came across her desk as the target in a new conservatorship case, she made the connection almost instantly. That evening, she called a private encrypted number I had provided her with her final grant letter, a number known only to her and my housekeeper, Maria. When Juliana Hayes took my son's case, she wasn't working for them. She was my field general, my eyes and ears deep inside the enemy camp. She was the first move in a chess game they didn't even know they were playing. The day of the decision arrived with a pale, uncertain morning light. Charles and Leo drove out to the ranch, their faces a carefully composed mixture of feigned gravity and poorly concealed excitement. They expected a war. They had prepared for tears, for bitter accusations, for a desperate, futile clinging to my home and my independence. I had them sit in the large living room, the same room where I had nursed their fevers, celebrated their birthdays, and mourned their father. Maria served them iced tea in tall glasses, her face an impassive mask, but I saw the loyal, protective fury simmering in her dark eyes. I let them make their final rehearsed speech about my well-being in their heavy hearts. Then I looked at them, my two sons, the men I had raised, the strangers sitting in my house, and I gave them the last thing on earth they expected. I agreed. "You're right," I said, my voice quiet but firm, imbued with a weariness I did not entirely have to feign. "I am tired. This big house, it has become a lot to manage." Charles's jaw actually went slack. Leo blinked several times, utterly baffled. You'll go?" he stammered, exchanging a look of pure disbelief with his brother. "I will try it," I clarified, giving them a small, watery smile that cost me a great deal to produce. "A trial month, to see if I like it, to prismatrezza, as you say." The relief that washed over their faces was so potent it was almost disgusting. They practically vibrated with triumph. They thought the final obstacle had simply lain down and surrendered. To them, it was the ultimate proof of my senility, a confirmation that I was too weak and confused to even fight for my own freedom. The victory was so easy, it didn't even feel earned. They immediately started making calls, arranging transport, talking about packing my things as if I were a piece of inconvenient luggage. As they were busy congratulating each other in the driveway, I caught Maria's eye through the kitchen window and gave a subtle, prearranged nod. She disappeared from view. Later that night, long after my sons had gone, she brought me a small encrypted satellite phone and a miniature recording device no bigger than a button. Juliana had delivered them that afternoon. My plan was not to run from my enemies. It was to walk into their fortress, lock the door from the inside, and burn it to the ground. They weren't sending me to a prison. I was sending them to school. My new life began in a suite that smelled of lemon polish, expensive potpourri, and quiet desperation. Sunset Vistas was exactly as the brochure promised. Manicured lawns that looked like green concrete, sparkling swimming pools where no one ever swam, and a staff that smiled with an unnerving, vacant persistence. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly suffocating. On the first day, Charles and Penelope helped me settle in. Their help consisted of going through my personal belongings with a fine-toothed comb under the guise of organizing. My personal cell phone was deemed too complicated and stressful. They replaced it with a laughably simple device, a white plastic brick that had only 3 oversized, pre-programmed buttons, one for Charles, one for Leo, and one for the front desk. They called it a safety measure. I knew it was a leash. They had the facility administrator inform me that my access to my personal email had been suspended to prevent online scams, and the staff was instructed that all my incoming calls were to be monitored for her own protection. The gilded cage had been locked, the key thrown away. They believed they had isolated me, severing my connections to the outside world. In reality, they had given me a new, target-rich environment for operations. I spent my days walking the pristine paths and sitting in the elegant, silent common rooms. I wasn't just passing time, I was listening, observing, gathering intelligence. I started conversations with the other residents, men and women of accomplishment, doctors, lawyers, entrepreneurs, who, like me, had built lives and fortunes only to be sidelined by impatient heirs. I met Arthur, a retired aerospace engineer who spoke in hushed tones about how his son had convinced him he had dementia in order to sell the patents for his last invention. I met Eleanor, a former concert pianist whose children had sold her beloved Steinway grand piano, claiming she didn't play it anymore. Their circumstances were all heartbreakingly, infuriatingly similar. They were trapped in a luxurious, systemic purgatory designed to manage them into irrelevance. With the miniature recorder Maria had given me, disguised as a simple turquoise pendant around my neck, I began to document their accounts. I would sit in on a game of bridge or share a cup of tea in the rose garden, and with a quiet click, I would capture their stories. Each hushed confession, each tale of a mysteriously vanished piece of jewelry or a suddenly altered will was another piece of evidence. It was another voice added to a chorus of the betrayed. I wasn't just fighting for my own company anymore. I was collecting the stories of an army of forgotten parents, and their testimonies would become my ammunition. While I gathered intelligence on the inside, Juliana was playing her part to perfection on the outside. She met with my sons weekly in her high-rise office, projecting an image of ruthless, cool efficiency. She drafted aggressive and legally airtight documents for the conservatorship, showed them complex flowcharts detailing how they would liquidate Vance Enterprises' smaller assets first, and fed their boundless greed with projections of swift and massive profits. They were utterly delighted with her. They saw her as their silver bullet, a legal shark who would tear through any obstacle for the right price. Trusting her implicitly, they confessed everything. They detailed their backroom plan to sell off the company's most valuable real estate holdings to a competitor at a fraction of their market value in exchange for a hefty, untraceable kickback. They showed her diagrams of the offshore accounts they had already set up in the Cayman Islands, ready to receive the flood of illicit cash. Every incriminating detail they gave her, she recorded and relayed to me through secure, encrypted messages. These messages would appear on a tablet Maria smuggled in during her weekly visits, a device cleverly disguised as a digital picture frame that cycled through bland family photos. It was a high-risk, high-stakes game of information transfer. Armed with the intelligence Juliana provided, I began my countermove. For decades, I had maintained a series of holding companies and offshore funds my children knew nothing about. This was the true bulk of my fortune, the real engine of my power, far exceeding the $12 million of declared assets they saw on the company books. It was my secret weapon, my queen on the chessboard. through Juliana, who acted through a labyrinthine chain of anonymous international brokers, I started buying. I began to acquire shares of Sunspire Holdings, the publicly traded parent corporation that owned the entire Sunset Vistas chain of luxury retirement communities. My purchases were small at first, scattered across different funds, designed to go completely unnoticed by market analysts. But as my children finalized their plans to seize my company, I was quietly, methodically, and relentlessly staging a takeover of my own prison. They were focused on stealing a single tree, utterly blind to the fact that I was buying the entire forest. The day they chose for my final surrender was a Tuesday, a day of bright, indifferent Arizona sunshine. They decided to stage the signing not at some sterile lawyer's office, but in the grand central hall of Sunset Vistas itself. It was a calculated and nauseating piece of theater designed to present a carefully curated picture of a happy family making a difficult but necessary transition. They had invited a few of the facility's top administrators and even a hand-picked resident or two to witness the event, all to create the illusion that this was a transparent and loving act. The hall was filled with pale afternoon light streaming through the massive picture windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. A heavy mahogany table was set up at the front, bearing a thick stack of legal documents and a ridiculously ornate fountain pen, as if this were the signing of a historic treaty. Charles wore his best navy suit, looking every bit the corporate heir apparent. Leo and Penelope stood beside him, their faces arranged in identical expressions of solemn support. They were practically radiating a smug, triumphant satisfaction. I was escorted into the hall by a nurse whose name I did not know. I played my role to perfection. I walked slowly, leaning heavily on her arm, and allowed my gaze to seem unfocused and a little confused. I sat down at the heavy table, my hands trembling slightly, a touch of method acting I was particularly proud of. Charles cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice full of the false, booming sentiment of a bad eulogy. He talked about new beginnings, about honoring Mom's incredible legacy, and about ensuring her comfort and security for years to come. He slid the thick document across the polished wood. It was the final transfer of power, the instrument of my legal death. It would give them total control of everything: my company, my properties, my money, even the right to make my medical decisions. All my life's work, all the risks I'd taken and battles I'd won, reduced to a single humiliating signature line. "Just sign here, Mom," Charles said, his voice dropping to a soft, persuasive murmur as he pointed to the last page. He uncapped the heavy fountain pen with a flourish and held it out to me. The room was utterly silent save for the hum of the air conditioning. The administrators watched with polite, detached smiles. My children leaned in, their eyes fixed not on me but on the pen, on my hand. This was it, the moment of their ultimate, effortless victory. I took the pen. Its weight felt strange in my hand, but I didn't move it toward the paper. Instead, I slowly, deliberately looked up, past my sons' eager faces, toward the main entrance of the hall. "I believe we're waiting for some additional guests," I said, my voice suddenly clear, steady and strong, entirely devoid of the pathetic frailty I had been projecting for months. Charles frowned, his performance breaking. "What are you talking about, Mom? Everyone is here." As if on cue, the large double doors of the hall swung open. A group of 7 men and women in sharp business suits walked in with purpose. They were the board of directors of Sunspire Holdings. My children stared, their triumphant smiles faltering and collapsing. They recognized a few of the powerful faces from the pages of the Wall Street Journal. They couldn't begin to comprehend what was happening. Juliana Hayes detached herself from the group and stepped forward, holding a sleek, leather-bound portfolio. She no longer looked like my son's ambitious young lackey. She looked like what she truly was, a formidable legal mind in complete and total command of the situation. "Charles, Leo, Penelope?" Juliana began, her voice crisp and echoing slightly in the stunned silence. "Before your mother signs anything, there's a small corporate announcement to be made. On behalf of the board, I'd like you to meet the new majority shareholder and newly elected chairperson of Sunspire Holdings." She paused, letting the tension build to a breaking point, then turned and gestured toward me. "Mrs. Nicoletta Vance." I pushed my chair back and stood up from the table. I felt no weakness in my knees, no tremor in my hands. I felt the strength of a lifetime of work, of struggle, of strategy, settle back into my bones. Behind me, a large projector screen on the wall, usually used for resident movie nights, flickered to life. The first thing that appeared was a complex financial flow chart, meticulously tracing the illegal kickback scheme my sons had arranged with their competitor. Then came the audio files. My sons' own voices filled the hall, captured by Juliana's recording pen during their strategy sessions, arrogantly detailing their plans to defraud their own company. My voice followed, then the voices of Arthur and Eleanor and a half-dozen other residents of Sunset Vistas, their stories of exploitation and betrayal recorded on my pendant. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and professionally presented. The administrator's polite smiles had vanished, replaced by masks of pure horror. My children's faces had turned a waxy, ashen gray. They were trapped. "All the evidence you see, and a great deal more, has been compiled into a comprehensive file," Juliana announced, her tone as cold and sharp as ice. "It will be delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona. It outlines a clear and prosecutable case for multiple federal charges, including conspiracy to commit wire fraud, violation of RICO statutes, elder abuse, and attempted theft of assets exceeding $50 million. You are, to put it in terms you'll understand, finished." The silence that fell in the hall was a physical thing, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on everyone. Charles, Leo, and Penelope stood frozen, the blood drained from their faces, looking like statues carved from chalk. The triumphant predators of a moment ago were now just scared, cornered, and hopelessly outmatched animals. The board members of Sunspire looked on with the cold, impassive disgust of judges. The facility administrators were already backing away, trying to physically and metaphorically distance themselves from the unfolding disaster. I walked around the heavy mahogany table until I stood directly in front of my children. I looked into their eyes I had once known better than my own, and I saw nothing but confusion and terror. I felt not hatred, but a profound and weary disappointment. This was the family I had built. This was the legacy they had chosen for themselves. "You have always fundamentally misunderstood the nature of wealth," I began, my voice steady and measured, cutting through the silence. "You saw it as a prize to be claimed, a life of luxury to be inherited. You never saw it for what it truly is, a tool, a responsibility, a force that can be used for good or for ill. You saw $12 million on the books of Vance Enterprises, and your greed made you blind. It never once occurred to you to ask what I did with the other $50 million. I let that number hang, in the air between us. $50 million, more than 4 times what they had schemed, lied, and betrayed for. "That money," I continued, "the real heart of my work, was never for you. It was for them." I gestured to the projector screen, where a slideshow of the smiling, elderly faces of the residents I had interviewed was now displayed. It was for people like Juliana, brilliant minds who needed a chance. It was for building things that last, libraries, scholarships, shelters, and now all of it, every last dollar, every share of stock, every deed to every property, has been irrevocably transferred into a new charitable foundation I have established. I paused, letting the full weight of their total, absolute loss sink in. They had schemed for everything and were now left with nothing. Less than nothing. "The foundation is called the Hope Center," I said. Its primary mission will be to advocate for the elderly, to build and reform living communities, to be safe and ethical, and to fund the legal defense of those who have been exploited by their own families. Your inheritance, the money you were willing to destroy me for, will now be used to stop people exactly like you, all across this country." They stared at me, their minds struggling to process the sheer scale of their ruin. Prison was no longer an abstract threat. It was a looming certainty. But I wasn't finished. I had one last offer to make. It was not an act of mercy. It was the beginning of their true and fitting punishment. "You have a choice," I announced, my voice leaving no room for argument or negotiation. Option 1. Juliana files the case with the federal prosecutor tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. You will be arrested, you will be tried, and you will be convicted. With this mountain of evidence, you will serve a minimum of 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Your lives, as you know them, will be over. Or, I said, stepping a little closer, forcing them to meet my gaze, Option 2. You will work for me. Not for Vance Enterprises. You will work for the Hope Center. You will dedicate the next 5 years of your lives to undoing the very kind of damage you tried to cause. There will be no salary. You will be provided with a small 2-bedroom apartment and a basic living stipend that covers food and utilities. You will work 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. You will surrender your passports to Juliana. If you fail in your duties, if you complain, if you break a single rule, the deal is off, and the charges will be filed that same day. 5 years of hard, humbling, anonymous work, or 20 years in a cell. The choice is yours. I then laid out the architecture of their new lives for them. Charles, my brilliant, pragmatic son who saw people as numbers on a spreadsheet, would work in the maintenance and administrative department of the facilities the Hope Center would acquire. He would not be a boss. He would be fixing leaky faucets, managing supply closets, personally responding to the complaints of residents, and ensuring the budgets were met. Leo, my charming, sociable son, would be a low-level assistant in the resident activities department. He would spend his days pushing wheelchairs to bingo games, reading newspapers aloud to the visually impaired, and offering simple companionship to the lonely people his own actions would have created. And Penelope, who so valued status and appearances, would work in personal care. She would be bathing, feeding, and dressing the most infirm residents. She would have to look into the eyes of the people she considered disposable and see their humanity, their fragility, their dignity, day after painful day. They would not be building a fortune. They would be building character brick by agonizing brick. Their prison would not have bars, but it would be a prison nonetheless, a prison of enforced empathy. The first year was the hardest, a long, brutal season of adjustment. My children, stripped of their wealth, their social standing, and their pride, were hollowed-out shells of their former selves. They moved into a small, functional 2-bedroom apartment in a nondescript complex near the first facility I had acquired and begun reforming under the Hope Center's management, a place, a universe away from the luxury of sunset vistas. Their days were a grueling, monotonous routine of tasks they had always considered beneath them. Charles, who once commanded boardrooms with a flick of his wrist, now spent his hours wrestling with faulty plumbing schematics and negotiating with linen supply vendors over cents per unit. I received a report that he spent an entire afternoon on his hands and knees, scrubbing a persistent scuff mark off a hallway floor, his expensive suit replaced by a simple janitor's uniform. His face, in the security footage, was a mask of grim, joyless determination. He rarely spoke, but he did the work. Leo, once the effervescent life of every party, found his easy charm useless among people who were hard of hearing, lost in memories, or simply too tired to be charmed. He was clumsy and awkward at first, a child playing at being a caregiver. I watched a recording of him trying to lead a sing-along, his voice cracking with uncertainty. But slowly, painfully, something shifted. He started to actually listen. He learned the residents' names, their favorite songs, their stories. He began organizing small events, a movie night featuring old black and white films, a quiet reading circle that brought genuine, flickering smiles to their faces. He was discovering a part of himself that didn't need an audience, just a connection. Penelope's transformation was perhaps the most profound and difficult. The first few months were a silent war of bitter resentment. She performed her duties with a cold, robotic efficiency, her jaw perpetually clenched. But you cannot bathe and feed the helpless day after day and remain unchanged. You cannot hold the frail hand of a dying woman and not feel the fragile pulse of your own humanity. She began to see the people behind the failing bodies. She held hands. She brushed hair. She listened to whispered fears in the dead of night. The disgust on her face was gradually, almost imperceptibly, replaced by a deep, aching compassion. The work was breaking them down, yes, but it was also rebuilding them into something new, something stronger. For 4 years, this was their world. They worked, they ate, they slept. They learned humility in 1,000 small ways. They learned the value of a day's labor and the immense weight of another person's trust. I watched them from a distance, receiving weekly video summaries and written reports from the facility managers. I never visited. I never called. This was their journey, their penance, and they had to walk it alone. Then, in the middle of their 4th year, a new external threat emerged. A rival corporation, a ruthless vulture capital firm named Sterling Acquisitions, saw Vance Enterprises as wounded and vulnerable. With its founder supposedly retired and its future profits funneled into a nonprofit trust, they smelled blood in the water. They launched a hostile takeover bid, a complex and aggressive legal and financial assault designed to seize control of the company. Their strategy was clear: buy up a controlling interest, dismantle the company, sell off its assets piece by piece, and shutter the Hope Center as an unprofitable liability. The news hit the business world like a shockwave. My financial advisors told me the fight would be brutal, expensive, and that our chances of success were slim. Sterling was infamous for its scorched earth tactics. My first instinct was to handle it myself, to marshal my resources and fight my last great battle alone. But then I looked at the most recent reports on my children. I saw the skills they were unknowingly honing. Charles now understood the inner workings of a large residential facility from the ground up, from the boiler room to the balance sheets. Leo knew how to communicate with people, to build consensus and loyalty. Penelope had developed a keen, intuitive understanding of human nature and a network of contacts among staff and families. They were no longer the spoiled, useless people who had betrayed me. I called them to the ranch. It was the first time they had been back in 4 years. They looked different, leaner, older, with a quiet, steady strength in their eyes. The artifice had been burned away. I didn't summon them to give them orders. I convened a war council. I laid out the entire situation on the massive dining room table. The financial reports, Sterling's strategy documents, the legal threats, the danger to the company and the foundation. I didn't tell them what to do. I simply looked at them and asked, "What do we do?" For the first time in their lives, I saw the spark of their true potential ignite. Charles pored over the financial documents, his old pragmatism now sharpened by a new sense of purpose. He found a weakness, a subtle but critical legal loophole in Sterling's financing structure. Leo, using the patient communication skills he'd learned, began a quiet but effective grassroots campaign. He reached out to the small individual shareholders of Vance Enterprises, the employees, the long-term partners, the families who had been with me for decades, and explained what was at stake. He didn't sell them a financial strategy. He reminded them they were part of a family, a legacy that was being threatened. And Penelope, using the social acumen she once wasted on meaningless cocktail parties, tapped into her old network. She gathered quiet, damaging intelligence on the head of Sterling Acquisitions, uncovering a history of unethical practices that would make him vulnerable to public and regulatory pressure. They worked together, seamlessly, a three-person army fighting for something they finally believed in. This battle wasn't about inheritance, it was about protecting their life's work. It was their final exam, and they were passing it with honors. The 5-year term ended on a quiet, crisp autumn day. The hostile takeover had been decisively defeated a few months prior, a hard-won victory that had left them exhausted but also solidified their new sense of purpose and shared competence. They had not only saved the company, they had made it stronger, more resilient. I had arranged to meet them in my office at the Vance Enterprises headquarters, the same sun-drenched corner office Charles had once coveted so fiercely it had driven him to betrayal. They walked in together, not with the apprehension of convicts facing a parole board, but with the calm, weary confidence of colleagues after a long project. Their sentences were served. They were free. By the terms of our agreement, they could walk away and start new lives with the clean slate they had so arduously earned. I had their final paperwork on my desk, along with 3 cashier's checks, each for a significant amount of money, enough for any of them to start over comfortably anywhere in the world. It wasn't an inheritance, but a severance, a final fair payment for 5 years of labor. Your 5 years are complete, I said simply, my voice even. You have fulfilled your end of the bargain. You are free to go. These checks should help you get started on whatever comes next. They looked at the checks lying on the polished desk, then at each other. There was no greedy gleam in their eyes, no rush to grab the money that once would have been the center of their universe. Charles was the one who finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "We're not leaving," he said. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a simple statement of fact. Leo nodded in agreement, his gaze direct and unwavering. Our work isn't finished. What we're building at the Hope Center, it's just the beginning. We want to stay, if you'll have us. Penelope, who had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed, added, her voice quiet but firm, "This is our life's work now, Nicoletta. It means more than any of this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent office, at the sprawling city skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling window. They had passed the final, unspoken test. The offer of money and freedom meant less to them than the purpose they had found in service. I felt a surge of an emotion I hadn't allowed myself to feel for 5 long years. Pride. A deep, powerful, and undeniable pride in the people they had forced themselves to become. But they had one more surprise for me. They had not come merely to ask to stay. They had come with a proposal. They unrolled a set of architectural drawings and a thick, professionally bound business plan across my desk. It was a meticulously detailed 15-year strategy for the national expansion of the Hope Center. It included detailed financial projections for acquiring and reforming underperforming care facilities, plans for building new, innovative elder care communities based on a model of dignity and autonomy, a strategy to create a self-sustaining endowment to ensure the foundation's existence in perpetuity, and a proposal for a national advocacy program to change legislation. It was brilliant, ambitious, and visionary. They hadn't just been doing their jobs, they had been thinking, planning, and dreaming of the future. They weren't asking for a handout or even a salary. They were asking for the responsibility to build a legacy. I looked at their faces, alive with a passion and intelligence that was no longer directed by greed but by purpose. These were not the grasping, hollow children who had sat across from me in that steakhouse, their smiles like poison. These were leaders. These were builders. These were my true successors. Without a word, I reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out my last will and testament, the one Juliana had drafted 5 years ago, the one that left every single thing I owned to the foundation. I tore it in half, then in quarters, and dropped the pieces decisively into the wastebasket beside my desk. "A will is for when you're gone," I said, looking each of them in the eye, seeing my own fire reflected there. "But I'm not gone, and this is no longer just my foundation." I took a fresh sheet of heavy, cream-colored letterhead from my desk. "Juliana will draft the new corporate governance documents tomorrow morning," I announced, my voice ringing with a new energy. "Vance Enterprises and the Hope Center will be fully merged into a single entity. The board of directors will have 4 co-chairs." I looked at my children, my partners. I had lost my heirs in a restaurant full of lies, but I had found my successors in the crucible of hard work and redemption. My legacy would not be a fortune left behind for others to squander. It would be mission carried forward by hands I could finally trust, and it would be safe. I'm grateful you spent this time with me. If you've lived through something similar, or if my story spoke to you in any way, please share your feelings in the comments. I'd love to hear them. Your stories matter too. If you want more, don't forget to like and subscribe. Be gentle with yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.